Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Executive Committee of Borough Council of the 18th of January 2022. Happy New Year to everybody in the room. For those of you I've not seen physically in person, although there's been enough meetings over the last couple of. Oh, is it Syrian for me? In which case I will move straight to the minutes. Are you content for me to sign the minutes of the 14th of December 2021? All those agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Apologies for absence, Louise.
Thank you, Chairman. I've received no apologies.
Thank you very much. Declarations of interest from anybody before the meeting?
None received, Chairman.
And any in the room right now? Seeing none. Okay, thank you. Questions from members of the public?
None received, Chairman.
Thank you. Questions from members of the council? None received, Chairman. And just before I go on, can I confirm that there are no speakers on any of the items on the agenda this evening?
That's correct.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move leaders and portfolio holders updates to the end of the session, as we'll be announcing a number of structural and role changes to the executive, in which case I shall move on to item 7, the affordable housing delivery strategy, which I'm going to introduce on behalf of Councillor Rosamond. I am pretty sure that every single one of you sitting here and a good proportion of our colleague councillors in general want to ensure that we have better and more affordable social housing provision. This document before you tonight introduces a strategy that I'm bringing to you today for authorisation to go out to wider consultation with various stakeholders, and it also presents the latest evidence on housing affordability within the borough. The core mantra of this document is a pretty straightforward one-line sentence: build more, build better, build for life. This aligns with multiple parts of our corporate strategy, from the provision of quality housing to energy bills for tenants, the impact of our homes upon the climate, and making sure that there are houses in Waverley that residents can actually afford, rather than the government definition of affordable housing that we are all so very familiar with by this point. I think the report is excellent and the document itself is fantastic, and I can't wait to see what comments wider stakeholders have, particularly tenants panel and housing providers. And I really do want to thank all of the housing team, and I'll say this at this point, not just for this document, but also for all of the work that you've done in supporting myself and other members of the executive during Councillor Rosamond's absence. Particularly though for this one, Andrew, Esther, Alice, and a number of others who have made sure that this is the fantastic document that it is, and really will deliver what we all mean by affordable housing, rather than the government. Any other comments on this document? Councillor Williams.
Yeah, really just to welcome this, building more, building better, building for life, I think does provide us with the kind of framework that we absolutely need, and particularly in terms of sustainability. Building for life means building in line with BFL1, promoting sustainability in every aspect of council development and delivering net zero homes, and not building in terms of the unsustainable. So I think this is a really welcome document. It's good for tenants, it's good for our community, it's good for meeting housing need, and it's good for our sustainability agenda. Thank you.
Councillor Palmer.
Yes, I'd like to join in endorsing the strategy and really welcoming the hard work which Anne-Marie and her team put into it, in particular Andrew Smith and his colleagues. I think councils right across Britain are wrestling with the dual problem of a lack of genuinely affordable housing, with the result that many people are paying a completely disproportionate part of their income towards either rent or purchase, and the fact that Waverley in particular is not particularly rich in areas where we want intensive construction. And I think the strategy really traces a viable path forward, which I hope we'll all be pleased to support in the coming years.
Thank you, Councillor Palmer. Any other speakers on this? Okay, seeing none, I'll bring it to the recommendation. It is recommended to the executive that the executive approves the draft affordable homes strategy and supporting evidence studies to be published for public consultation between the 27th of January 2022 and the 24th of February 2022. Can all those in favour please indicate? Thank you, that's unanimous. Okay, moving then on to item 8. Bear with me one moment. Item 8 is the Housing Review Account Progress Report, April to November 2021. There is a recommendation here regarding environments, so to update the HRA budgets according to the needs and ensure services and works continue to be delivered during 21-22. The original HRA budget, which was passed in 21-22, was agreed by Council in February 21 during COVID. And in light of the changes in needs to tenants, access to suppliers and contractors, this report is updating, it seeks to provide an update to the Landlord Services Advisory Board and realign those budgets with the current situation. And this has now been before the Housing Landlord Services Board at the latter end of last year, 13th of December. And obviously that board now includes members of the tenants panel. So the recommendation before you is that we approve a number of environments to align the budgets to the needs detailed in Annex 1. Are there any other comments on this particular item? Otherwise, I'll move to the recommendation. No. Okay, in which case the recommendation is that the executive approves environments of the budget within the HRA to realign the budget to the need as detailed in Annex 1. Can I have all those in favour please indicate? Thank you very much, everyone. And what will be for me my last opportunity to present a housing matter before we make a number of changes. So item 9, Housing Maintenance Procurement Outcome Report. Bear with me 1 second. I think one of the most common comments that all of us receive from residents, certainly it is for me, is regarding housing repairs. A number of times that's a good thing, they're excellent comments, but when they are bad, they're often very bad. And certainly once a bad opinion takes root, it's quite difficult to do anything about that going forward and really change somebody's perspective about the service that they've had up to that point. We have, I think, all of us experienced quite serious frustration regarding how the contract for housing maintenance has been really over the life of the administration so far. COVID has hampered some of this, and selections of contractors has hampered other elements, and various interims and other issues have I think hampered us trying to do something about that in a more meaningful way. This process, which Councillor Rosman initiated with officers a little while ago, brings forward a new permanent contractor for that particular aspect of housing maintenance, one that I think we can build a better relationship with, one that we can monitor more appropriately with robust KPIs and contractual terms that allow us to make sure that residents get absolutely everything they need and deserve in our social accommodation. Before you is the recommendation that we note the procurement process. Is obviously not something that we influence in this case of the procurement process, but notes the process going through and appoints Ian Williams Limited to this position, and requests that officers report to the Landlord Services Board within 9 months of the outcome of mobilisation. I would add that actually it'll likely come before the Landlord Services Board and also ONS in a few other ways in terms of its management of its KPIs. Are there any speakers on this item? No, in which case the recommendation is in 2 parts. It's recommended that the executive notes the procurement process undertaken for the housing maintenance service, and that following a comprehensive tender evaluation process, Ian Williams Limited achieved the highest combined scores for price and quality and has been confirmed as the preferred bidder, and subject to contract and final due diligence will be awarded the contract. And bullet 2 requests that officers report to the Landlord Services Advisory Board within 9 months on the outcome of the mobilisation of the new contract and the performance of the contractor. And I would just note for the future housing portfolio holders that it probably needs to be earlier than that, and that 9 months is a maximum. And if all those in favour of the 2 recommendations, please show. Thank you very much. Bear with me 1 moment. And I'll now move on to the Waverley Borough Council draft tree and woodland policy to be introduced by Councillor Townsend.
Thank you, Leader. I have brought this before the executive previously, so they are quite familiar now with this tree and woodland management policy. And it demonstrates yet again our commitment to improving biodiversity across the borough and meeting our commitment to our declaration of climate change. Sorry, Leader, is there a problem? Apologies, I'll move that to one side maybe. I'd like to thank Arno particularly for all of his hard work on this policy, and his professional approach and enthusiasm for trees and hedgerows is boundless, and his knowledge is really extensive. This policy forms part of a suite of policies, environmental policies, which include our pesticides policy, and a forthcoming biodiversity policy, which we're producing with the assistance of Surrey Wildlife Trust. This tree and woodland policy, management policy, is critical to ensure that not only do we plant more trees and hedgerows, but that we also manage our existing tree stock, which captures far more carbon than new trees. Typically, a tree captures about 21 kilograms of carbon dioxide per year, but that is only when it's fully grown. So it is really important that we manage our tree stock so that it includes to capture the maximum amount of carbon. These policies form the foundation, so our biodiversity policy and our pesticides policy and our tree and woodland management policy all form the foundation for our overarching green spaces strategy, which will be the next strategy that the green spaces team will produce. And this will draw together all of our objectives for our green spaces and the considerable amount of land and wildlife, important wildlife habitat that Waverley manages across the borough. I would like to present this report and the policy to the executive for adoption. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Townsend. I think I'll just hark back to when Councillor Williams and I sat in this chamber with students talking COP26, and that very, very quick realization that if you plant a bunch of trees now in 2021, the amount of impact that they will have and how grown they will be will not be significant to make any particular impact by 2030 or even in some cases 2050. And for me, that underlines entirely why it's so important for us to protect what we already have in terms of our green infrastructure. I'll broadly label it as that. Are there any other speakers? Councillor Williams.
Yes, thank you, Leader. And again, reiterating what Leader has said, which is that clearly there is a long lead-in time in terms of the benefits of planting trees, and it does mean to say that we do need to protect the trees that we have. I really just wanted to sort of add my own welcome to this strategy, and it's another step on our road to supporting biodiversity in the way that Councillor Townsend has suggested, it does link in with a range of other policies which we have developed under this administration, including our carbon neutrality action plan, our pesticides policy, green spaces strategy, and our emergent biodiversity policy, all of which I think are absolutely crucial towards responding as a council to our climate and the ecological emergency. And I personally would like to thank Councillor Townsend for my engagement in the development of this strategy in terms of my own sustainability role, and add my thanks to the officer team, and particularly our dedicated tree officer in the shape of Arno to develop this excellent strategy. So certainly has my support, and I'd commend it to the executive.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Any other speakers before I bring it to a recommendation? Okay, seeing none, the recommendation, it is recommended that the executive approve the tree and woodland policy attached at Annex 1 to the report. Can I have all those in favour, please indicate. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, bear with me one moment. Moving then on to item 11, capital projects, which I would imagine is being introduced by Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you, Leader. Good evening, everybody. So this item, pages 123 to 132 of your packs, is an ongoing item. So back in February 2021 at our budget meeting, you'll undoubtedly recall that we agreed a figure of £359,500 for discretionary projects, and subsequently established a projects coordinating group to consider, prioritise and identify the discretionary projects that would go forward for funding from this pot. In July 21, we approved £198,000 for expenditure, and this is the next round of allocation, asking for £76,000 of the remaining £161,000 to be approved. This particular round focuses particularly on our pavilions, where we commissioned a review, a status report, and it became very clear from that asset management plan that the pavilions, like so many other things around the country, have really fallen behind in terms of maintenance, repair, that we've not been able to afford because we simply haven't had the funding. So I'm very pleased that in this case, we'll at least be able to address some of the most severe cases, one of which is contingent on the circumstances described in the report, but otherwise should go ahead. And just to record also that there are other projects in the pipeline that we believe will enable the whole balance of the remaining funds to be spent before the end of the year. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. And just to confirm, if you would, that in part 2, the 76080, that's the upper limit.
Yes.
Yeah, and it is possible it'll be less than that, but that's the maximum it can be allocated.
That's the maximum that'll be allocated. And as far as the Bourne Pavilion is concerned, the 67, the whole lot is contingent on discussions with the current tenant who have been planning for some time to actually rebuild the pavilion. We have a list of works that we want to do to the pavilion, but clearly it's not common sense to spend a whole load of money on a building that might very well be knocked down in the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. That's very clear. Any other speakers? Councillor Townsend.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank Mark and that for putting this money into improving our pavilions. I think it's really important that as a council that we provide first-rate facilities and that we provide access to health and well-being and access to leisure through our parks and green spaces. And we did obviously inherit these buildings. That, you know, these buildings have been an asset of Waverley for a very long time, and I think it's commendable that we are now beginning to look at clear improvement plans for these buildings so that people can enjoy these places for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Townsend. Any other speakers? Okay, in which case I'll move to the recommendation in 2 parts. Part 1 notes that the asset management plan produced by the engineers for pavilions across the borough and the RAG rating to prioritise works that are now critical. And part 2, approve the value of up to £76,080, caveated as described by Councillor Merriweather, from the 2021-2022 capital budget. Can I have all those in favour, please indicate. Thank you. Okay. And then item 12, which is the Waverley Borough Council draft tax strategy 2022-24, also to be introduced by Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you again, Leader. This is on pages 133 to 142 of your packs. It is called Tax Strategy 22-24, but the one thing it does not deal with is council tax or the taxes that we levy. This is a report that we're required to have. We're required to have a tax strategy to fulfill our responsibilities under legislation and to respond appropriately to the inverted commas tackling tax evasion : government guidance for the corporate offences of failure to prevent the criminal facilitation of tax evasion, close inverted commas, government guidance issued in September 2017. So the purpose of this report is to demonstrate that we acknowledge our responsibilities with regard to tax, but not the tax that we levy, by preparing and submitting for approval this tax strategy, which I recommend. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Murray. Were there any other speakers on this item? No? Okay, moving then to the recommendation. It is recommended that the executive approves the tax strategy 2022 to 24 as recorded at Annex 1. Can I have those in favour, please indicate. Thank you all. Okay, we now move back in the agenda to item 6 to cover leaders and portfolio holders announcements. Before I get on to the main element of this, I'll just catch up on a couple of other things that have happened over Christmas and since we all last met here. I want to commend Waverley Borough Council officers, and also I believe it's the United Reformed Church in Godalming for their efforts in managing the aftermath of the fire at Grayleys in Charterhouse Ward. Waverley Borough Council officers responded extremely quickly, and members of the local community did a fantastic job in helping all of those that were involved as much as they could do. A very sad incident. I think there were a number of injuries and certainly one fatality, but I think it bodes very well for how we respond to emergencies, and I just want to record publicly my thanks and certainly those of Godalming councillors on behalf. Councillor Williams, did you just want to comment on that bit particularly?
Yeah, just obviously wanted to comment on that as a ward member for the Charterhouse ward, and it was a very tragic event, and I think the response was, as our leader has described it, absolutely exemplary in terms of the rapidity with which the residents were temporarily housed and then moved on to more permanent accommodation following this tragic event. So I think it did put to the test our emergency response, and I would congratulate the officers involved in Waverley as well as the other emergency services in their response to this particular event. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. In terms of other matters going on at the moment, the Guildford Waverley collaboration, we started the first of what will be a number of weekly subject matter groups on the inter-authority agreement and risks, which are being drafted for council at present. That will come back in its whole form to executive and to council at a later date, but so far a very constructive set of discussions with obviously a fairly broad group of people, both at Waverley Borough Council and at Guildford Borough Council. There are a number of planning matters which I'm not going to dwell on immediately. I will ask the appropriate people to comment on that, and I'm sure a number of members of the executive will have some comments on current planning matters. But I'll get on to the main section of my update. So following discussion with the other administration group leaders, so that's Councillor John Ward, Councillor Peter Clarke, Councillor Steve Williams and Councillor Nick Palmer, thank you for your contributions. I have a number of revisions to the structure and roles of the executive. Councillor Anne-Marie Rosenman, who's the portfolio holder for housing, has taken the decision to step down from the executive for the sake of her health. I obviously fully support this decision, as any member's health is far more important, far the most important consideration, and I want to make sure that that's respected. She's going to remain a borough councillor and a town councillor. She's also my ward colleague, and I'm sure will continue to offer the sorts of contributions that she has been making to this council since day one of our administration. I can't adequately express properly what I think all of us as councillors, particularly members of the executive, owe Anne-Marie in terms of the time and dedication, work, just pure compassion that she has put into the role of housing portfolio holder. As her ward colleague, and I get some of these comments from other parts of the borough too, I know there are quite literally hundreds of residents that she has helped in some way, shape or form throughout these last 3 years. And I know they would second all of the comments I've made in a heartbeat. I don't think we'll be quite the same without her. I'm always very sad to lose somebody that we've had here since day one. I think she's leaving some very significant shoes to fill when it comes to housing. And we've all, I think, as we've seen tonight, seen that social housing is a core duty of this council. And reflecting on the large amount of work that Anne-Marie has put in, we've come to the decision that housing in this administration is simply too significant a role for one individual to cover without incurring some kind of consequences. Therefore, the change that I'm proposing in housing also is an ideal opportunity to make a number of other changes, which I intend to announce now. There will be a short press release at some point this evening or tomorrow morning, which will put these into effect. and they will come into full effect at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Waverley full councillors and staff have been apprised of this full schedule prior to this meeting. So myself, Peter Clarke, Penny Marriott, Mark Merriweather and Steve Williams, the roles remain completely unchanged. There are no additions or modifications to remit or scope. There will be one clarification for myself and Peter Clarke, who will now have an explicit responsibility for the Guildford and Waverley collaboration as part of our role, in line with also what I imagine the leader and deputy leader at Guildford will be doing at the appropriate time. There are a number of change roles, which I'll read out in alphabetical order. Andy McLeod is to become the portfolio holder for enforcement operations and Brightwells. I'd like Andy to take this opportunity to thank you for all of your work and leadership within planning. You've undertaken this with a great deal more patience than I imagine some would be capable of, and it's a role that I know that attracts probably the most controversy and the most flack of any member role on the executive. So I really do want to thank you for that, and particularly your role in getting LPP2 in front of the inspector. Your ability to remain calm and objective through that process, other than being a balance for me, who is often decidedly not when it comes to planning, has been fundamental to making sure that that has happened. So Andy's now going to take on enforcement, and this is an expanded enforcement role, which is including a new mandate to address some of the business transformation elements of enforcement and bring them together. And Andy's of course going to retain all of his current responsibilities regarding Brightwells. Next, some minor changes to Councillor Mirali's portfolio, which is now entitled Portfolio Holder for Health, Wellbeing, Parks and Leisure. Kika's going to take over the Parks and Leisure elements from Liz, but her role in all other respects remains the same. Councillor Liz Townsend now becomes the portfolio holder for planning and economic development. So Liz is going to take that on, but retain the leadership of the Cranley Leisure Centre project, which of course at the moment is not a leisure centre being run in terms of it's really a capital design and planning project for the foreseeable future, and will continue to lead the council's governance work regarding Dunsfold. And then finally, as I alluded to at the beginning of this introduction, housing will be split into two roles as co-portfolio holders. First off, Councillor Nick Palmer, who will be co-portfolio holder for housing delivery, which will encompass delivery of new social housing opportunities, oversight of development projects, housing strategy, which we shared with his colleague, and will also encompass homelessness and refugee management within the borough. Nick will also continue to serve as the chair of the SIL board. Just going back to my earlier comments regarding the importance of housing, there is no, I would have found it very difficult to hand over the social housing aspect of this to anybody that I knew was not committed to delivering genuinely affordable and good quality social housing. And I have no doubt, Nick, that you care about this as genuinely as anybody I've ever met. So I'm very comfortable handing that on to you. And finally, Councillor Paul Rivers, who will join the executive as of tomorrow morning, will be the co-portfolio holder for housing operations, which will include the maintenance of the current housing stock, oversight of the new responsive repairs contract that we've been discussing this evening, and will share in the management of housing strategy with Councillor Palmer. The two roles will function in a revised governance model that will be confirmed by the new portfolio holders in due course, and they will rotate the chairmanship of the Housing Landlord Services Board going forward. I'm going to go very quickly back to one of the first things I started, and I'm hoping other members will share this. I just want to give my heartfelt thanks to Anne-Marie Rosamond for everything that she's done and will, I'm sure, continue to do as a councillor. I'm sure other members will comment, but I think she has achieved a great deal, and I know she has worked fantastically with the housing team, who have given her just amazing support over the last 3 years. I'm now going to hand over to Councillor Peter Clarke before I do what will be a follow-up on and conclusion for some portfolio holders on some matters, and I imagine some comments on planning. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Leader. This evening, rather than make any update regarding the portfolio for business transformation and IT, I feel instead it would be more appropriate to take a few minutes paying a tribute to Anne-Marie Rosamond and at the same time thanking Andy McLeod. People like Anne-Marie and Andy don't appear as councillors at Waverley very often, and when they do, we should be very grateful for the contribution they make to our residents and indeed the well running of the council. I of course wish Anne-Marie all the best for the future. And also I give full support to Andy in taking up his new challenge with enforcement, where he will be contributing to the modernisation and development of a new enforcement plan for the borough. With regard to the role Andy has played in getting Local Plan Part 2 over the line to the inspector just before Christmas, Andy has shown great patience in this work, whilst having to endure some political flack. Planning sometimes does become a political football, which of course it shouldn't. But Andy has put these political shenanigans to one side and has simply got on with the job. He's not alone in this respect. Our entire executive is comprised of 4 different political groups who have all worked together seamlessly over the past 2.5 years and have simply got on with the job. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to move round in no particular order. Oh, sorry. I'm going to move round in no particular order, starting with Councillor Andy MacLeod.
Thank you, Leader. I'd like, first of all, to join in and support your comments about, and Peter's comments about Anne-Marie. She was clearly an outstanding member of the executive. She's a very nice person, very committed person, and she'll be greatly missed in her role on the executive. It's clear it is an enormous job, housing, actually. Probably the biggest job on the executive. There's 2 heads of service for housing within the officer group, and it clearly does need 2 people to do the job that Anne-Marie was doing on her own. In terms of your comments about me, they're extremely embarrassing, certainly over generous, but I have to thank both you and Peter for them. I've been doing this job, as Olive has, for 2 years and 8 months. And I think it is an appropriate time, you know, obviously brought about partly by Anne-Marie's unfortunate having to stand down. It is an appropriate time to perhaps make some changes, and it is a good time to change from planning from myself to Liz, and I'm sure Liz will do an excellent job on it, and I wish her well. In terms of actually the portfolio update, portfolio does update, I'll mention Brightwells briefly in that we have a Brightwells meeting next Wednesday. We remain totally committed, the executive remains totally committed to the success of the Brightwells project. I was one of the people in Farnham who wasn't very keen on Brightwells, but I'm now a total convert. Converts are often the most zealous people. I must have to be, and I'm a total supporter of the success of Brightwell, and we'll do our absolute best to make sure it's successful. We have a meeting next Wednesday with Chris Nicholson in Surrey, and we'll see how they're getting on with their plans to find tenants for the scheme. That is a bit of a worry, actually, that the scheme is due to open in August. We've heard for 2 or 3 meetings now, very optimistic projections about the tenancy, and it does sound good. So let's just hope that on Wednesday we'll get some good news about some people actually signing up. In terms of planning, I certainly would like to thank Zach and his team for the tremendous work they've done in the time that I've been working with them. We've got a very strong planning team, in my opinion. It's a difficult situation, planning, because as I think as Zach has told us, it's very much a sort of employees market in planning right now. Planning officers in great demand. It's difficult to fulfill planning positions, but Zach and his team are doing particularly well in that respect. And the DM side is certainly improving. We've got the new DM manager, business manager, who's doing an excellent job. And we have succeeded in submitting LPP2. I'd like to comment briefly on the business of the criticism that we're getting. I could spend quite a long time coming out with some facts and figures to actually prove that the lack of a 5-year housing supply, which is the main reason for the Lockswood Road appeal being refused, is not actually our fault. But I don't propose to do that this evening. It would just take too long. But I'd like to make some general statements about the situation. The problems in planning actually are not just sit within Waverley. They very much come from the government. The government is actually imposing unrealistic planning targets or housing targets on very many councils, including Waverley. We're given a target of 590 houses a year. And in the first 6 years of the local plan, which started in 2030 when the Conservatives were in charge, the council failed to meet the target. And I wouldn't entirely blame the Conservatives for this by any means, because actual housing is actually built by the developers, not by the council. So, and there's a limited amount that the council can do other than keep granting planning permissions. And in that 6 years, approximately 1,000 planning permissions were granted each year. So something like 6,000 or so out of the roughly 11,000 that we have to provide over the 19 years of the local plan were granted in the first 6 years. And that has actually continued. So there's plenty of planning permissions being granted for developers to build houses, but they're not actually building them at anything like the level required to maintain a 5-year housing supply. We inherited this big deficit, and the target number went up from the 590 to 917 a year, which is an almost impossible number to achieve in Waverley. There's never been more than 600 approximately houses built in Waverley in any 1 year. In the first 2 years of this administration, just over 600 were produced each year, which has reduced the target to 892 a year, but that's still pretty impossible. As I say, I could go and spend more time going into the numbers, and I will do separately from this situation. But the problem that we're faced with is not this council's, not this administration's problem. It comes from government policy. It comes from the delays in producing a local plan under the previous administration. And it comes from house builders not building houses at the level required. They will build houses at the level, the optimum level for their profitability, not for the requirement of the local council. So that's all I want to say at the moment, Leader. I think this will be a big subject for us to address and make sure that the residents understand it and that all our councillors understand it, because it is slightly complicated to understand. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor MacLeod. And I think just probably to add to that, without wishing to get into the political mire that is planning policy, and I do agree that being held as a borough, as all boroughs are, responsible for the delivery of houses upon land that we do not own or manage is unreasonable. But I think the numbers of confusions and other issues with planning, it behooves us to try and communicate a factual position as a baseline for where we are. And it's for that reason that the planning team and the communications team will be collating some of these basic factual points so that we can try and present them in a way that everybody can engage with. And at which point we'll move from there in terms of further comments. So there won't be any knee-jerk reaction, I think, officially from the council to some of this before we've established what the facts of the situation objectively are. But just to reiterate, thank you very much, Andy, for everything you've done with planning and for getting us to where we are so far, which is a significantly further distance along than when we started in 2019, when we got here, and a month and a half after Local Plan Part 2 had been pulled off the agenda of full council by the now opposition. Does any other member wish to say anything on planning before we move on to the other portfolio holders? Councillor Townsend and then Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you, Leader. First of all, I know that a lot has been said about Anne-Marie, but not enough can ever be said. I mean, I must admit that she has been a genuinely joy to work with, and she worked so hard and a real passion for housing. And she's going to be a huge loss to the executive. And I'm really glad that she's remaining as a councillor, because at least we still have her contributing to the council. But she will be very much missed. And thank you, Andy, for all his work so far, and for all the work that he's done on the planning portfolio. And we've always worked really well together, and I know that Andy has a wealth of experience, and I can pick up the phone and call him anytime to check on things, and I'm sure that will be great in the coming months as well. So you know, there's been a lot said, and I have to agree very much with what Andy's already said about planning. You know, there's been a lot of hyperbole bandied about regarding the council's 5-year housing land supply. And coming from Cranley, believe you me, I know what it feels like to have major developments that have received hundreds of letters of local objections, and that has been refused by this council, by the planning committee, and then see that overturned by the government's inspector. And I do understand the feeling of anger and powerlessness that many residents in Orfold now feel after the overturning of the Loxwood Road development. It is clear that the opinion of the planning inspector for the Loxwood Road has been devastating for the Orfold community, and I appreciate that they may well feel under siege. And this has been the case for all villages within Waverley that are located on countryside beyond the green belt, and that area has extremely limited protection under government planning policy. It isn't Waverley's planning policy, it is government planning policy. And our greenfields are the first to be sacrificed once developers fail to deliver the housing that they have previously promised. We all know, and even government ministers have said this to me, that they, in person, that they know that the government's policy on the housing delivery test, which tests us for the 5-year housing land supply, is fatally flawed, and yet they do not change it. Us as a planning authority, as Waverley, as a we are able to grant planning permissions, but we cannot deliver the housing. We're allocated a government target for housing, as Andy mentioned previously, and we can grant those planning permissions, but we cannot build the houses. And the irony is, with the housing delivery test, is that if the houses are not delivered, so they're not built in time each year when we're tested, then we are penalised. And those penalties mean not only that we have to deliver more planning permissions, but equally what happens is that our planning policies are basically overturned at times, really. They're relaxed in such a way that sites which we would have refused, which we would have viewed as unsustainable, which we would have viewed as having environmental damage, that would perhaps impact heavily on the character of areas, are then deemed to be granted approval, that we have to grant approval for. And again, this is government policy, this is not our policy. And the other thing that is, and people can wax lyrical about, you know, our local plan perhaps being in tatters, etc. But actually, we try and engage the community. We engage people on the local plan, we present sites, we seek consultation. The same thing on neighbourhood plans. Communities work so hard to deliver neighbourhood plans, but basically, as soon as the developers do not deliver the housing, those are swiped away, just swiped away. The views of the community, the views of Waverley councillors are no longer relevant. And basically the government's planning inspector makes the final decision. So as you can see, not only is the 5-year housing delivery test fatally flawed in the way that actually it doesn't deliver the housing for people because developers deliver the housing, but also you could almost see that it acts as an incentive for developers. Developers that have housing sites know that if they trickle feed that housing, that actually they might get planning permission on a site nearby or in another part of the borough, that they know in normal circumstances they wouldn't get planning permission for, that we wouldn't grant planning permission. So there is a perceived incentive for developers not to deliver housing to the extent that as a council we meet our 5-year housing delivery test. It is a policy, it is a government policy that drives a sledgehammer through local plans and through neighbourhood plans. And it is a policy also that limits supply of housing. And to be honest, that also keeps house prices high. And it provides eye-watering returns to developers and their investors. And to be honest, it also prevents people from getting on the housing ladder in this area. To try and blame this policy on the council, of any council, is actually misleading. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Townsend. Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you, Leader. Yeah, I want to, I'll come back to talk about Anne-Marie when I talk about my my own portfolio, but just on planning. Yeah, I mean, we're given this title local authority when it comes, or planning authority when it comes to planning, which is a joke. We're not a planning authority. What authority we've got is ersatz. It's, you know, it's what we're allowed to do. And the minute we dare to do anything or try to do anything remotely democratic, we get overturned on appeal when the matters are taken out of our hands. That there is a universal expectations gap between what residents think we have the authority to do and what we actually have the authority to do. And the only authority we have is to do as we're told by the central government according to their policies. And it is a joke. And the sooner that expectations gap is filled, the better. And I particularly want to endorse the emphasis that's being given separately now to planning authority, because exactly the same criticisms can be leveled at planning enforcement as can be leveled at planning permissions. Is enforcement's a joke? It's just as biased in favour of the developer as planning permissions, and it needs to be reformed. We have an executive function. We don't have a democratic or authoritative function to implement a policy and a system that is fundamentally unfit for purpose, and it's not fair.
Thank you. And I just, Councillor Mirali.
Thank you, Leader. As I've been on Western planning now for several years, I cannot tell you how utterly, utterly depressing the whole thing is. First of all, Andy has always been brilliant. When I've rung him up and said, I don't know about this, he will always talk me through it very patiently, has explained this whole convoluted nonsense to me. And I'd like to thank both Liz and you, and I wish more people were listening to understand the situation we find ourselves in. I've always despised the last incumbents, the way they were constantly patting themselves on their backs and saying, you know, as a council, we're really good. I hate that sort of thing. But the reality is as a council, this is what we are left with, and this is what we're dealing with. And I remember being at that very contentious one, and John Rubini, and I copied him when he said, I will not support the diktats of this government. And we will support the 539 people who do not want these houses here, which are not social housing, which are not affordable housing, and which will, you know, capsize the local diversity and wildlife. So I just wish people would properly listen to us and understand it's not about our egos, it's not about saving our jobs as councillors, it's actually we live in this society, we care about this just as much. And I just thank you guys for saying what you said tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Mirali. As a long-suffering member of Eastern myself, I completely sympathise, and I'm sure those of us who've served on planning committees here, all of us have had experiences like that. But of course, planning isn't political, is it? Despite the fact that the root of all of these issues is in fact completely and absolutely political at almost all times. I wanted just to conclude this section before I move to the other portfolio holders, just to address a few questions I've had from residents directly regarding the Loxley appeal in Allfold. Firstly, sorry, Lockswood appeal, apologies, in Alfold. At least, unlike the planning inspectorate, I've at least pronounced and spelled the parish correctly, which was something that was not in a number of the decision documents themselves. So first off, in terms of the webcast, it was noted by a number of residents of Alfold that the Lockswood appeal was not webcast, whereas the Scotland Lane Red Court appeal was webcast. I will just double check this with the monitoring officer or possibly Louise, just to be absolutely sure that this is correct. My understanding was that the Alfold appeal began whilst prior to Plan B arrangements being taken on board, and so started and I believe finished in the chamber in person, and so there was no standing requirement to put a web stream up. Whereas the Scotland Lane appeal started exclusively on Zoom, and so there was a requirement to have that streamed as we were going. But my understanding is there was no requirement to stream the Alfold appeal. Now, there's a number of residents who've written to me about that. I will clarify that in writing and get back to you. And I think we can have a separate discussion about whether we're streaming planning appeals in general going forward. Another aspect of it is Dunsfold. So one of the key elements of the decision notice was that Dunsfold was considered not deliverable within the 5-year period. Well, I think first off, I just want to remind people that we can thank the incumbent MP for South West Surrey, as well as the previous MP for Guildford, for calling in the Dunsfold Park development back in a number of years ago, which is possibly one of the reasons that we aren't talking about the half-finished or even completed Dunsfold Park Garden Village at this point, and that being completely immaterial to this appeal. But of course, we're not. And of course, we don't own the land. We made a very good attempt to try and rectify this directly, but we don't own the land and we can't go and deliver the houses for a developer. I think most of us who've read this, and I don't want to put words in the mouth of the head of planning, but I think he was of the same view, thought that the inspector's decision notice here was actually grossly disproportionate to what we would expect. And that's been backed up by Council opinion as well. And of course, we are considering our options where we're able to. And certainly we will be making sure that our opinion as a council is made clear to the inspectors at any other appeals that have either recently concluded or will be coming. But we'll obviously get back to this in due course. And I think we'll be trying to start from a position of communicating the facts as objectively as possible about this, as I think we have a duty as councillors to try and inform our residents as to the facts about this system, so that when they are lobbying people, they know who to lobby and they know what to lobby about. And frankly, they need to understand that things like the government need to understand that situations like we see in Alfold, where they are getting something like 3 or 4 times the housing that has been allocated, where there is demonstrably inadequate infrastructure to provide even for the houses that are there, let alone the ones that are planned, is unacceptable and flies in the face of all sense, let alone what residents would expect in a democracy. My part of the rant over on planning. I think that was cathartic for all of us. I'll move on now to Councillor Palmer, and I'll go around everybody before we close up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And first, I'd like to thank the leader for his rather touching comments, which I'll try to live up to. One reason that I got involved in council politics was that I was concerned to try to help address the really serious issue of shortage of decent, affordable housing in our area. And I think that's something which is felt by people across a wide variety of political persuasions. Solving it is a challenge, but we'll do our best. I'd like to support everything that's been said about Anne-Marie and bring it to the simple point that it's not often that one person having to stand down for health reasons has to be replaced by 2 people. And whereas I hesitate to try and fill her shoes, I'll try to fill one of her shoes. On my current portfolio, which I'm giving to the trusty hands of Andy, the new charges for parking have bedded down largely without incident and without the dip in usage which some people had projected. In general, we have tried to avoid creating lots of special cases. And I do apologize to those groups who actually looked at individually have quite a strong case for special treatment. But if we give special treatment to all such cases, then we undermine the whole basis of a strategy and we undermine the council's revenue stream. So we do have to be very selective. And we have so far just looked at one change, which is at Farnham Leisure Centre, where respecting the fact that we very much want people to use the leisure centre and to contribute to the public health objectives, we are looking again at the charging there. We're talking to the leisure centre management, and we're very much influenced here by the arguments put forward by residents. One can have a strategy, but one has to listen as well. And there were pretty powerful arguments here. We'll try to respond to them.
Thank you, Councillor Palmer. I think that'll be welcomed throughout the community that use the leisure centre. Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you, Leader. Yes, I just a couple of words for Anne-Marie. She will be missed, and for me, she will be missed on the executive, not only because of her personality and her contribution, but she was uniquely qualified. She was professionally qualified as a solicitor. She was also qualified by experience. She had relevant direct experience, not only of the kind of contracts that this council enters into, but having been brought up in a council house in social housing, she had direct relevant experience of what our tenants experience. And I can't think of a better person, better qualified to take on the roles that she did. And we're going to miss her in person and professionally as well. If I can just touch on my own portfolio. So last Friday, we published our draft 22-23 budget and medium-term financial plan through to 25-26 ahead of the Council's Policy Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting on the 25th of January. While the budget proposals do include a £5 increase in Waverley's Band D council tax charge for 22-23, they also provide significant additional funding to help those households most financially affected by the pandemic and the rising cost of living. There are no proposed cuts to services or reductions in overall funding for community organisations. The Council's medium-term financial plan looks forward over the next 4 years to anticipate the spending pressures faced by Waverley. The latest projections show gross budgetary pressures of £14.8 million over the next 4 years, with £12.8 million of compensating savings identified to date from a range of efficiency and income measures, including the collaboration with Guildford Borough Council. The financial projections include a range of assumptions that have been made in very uncertain economic conditions. In addition to the growing threat from inflation, there are still and could be further significant implications for the Council's financial position from the pandemic and the recovery of income streams from our car parks and leisure centres. Apart from COVID, we face other significant headwinds. Currently, inflation alone adds around £900,000 to the cost of providing our services each and every year, while the council tax increase next year will bring in only an additional £277,000. What's more, we also expect central government to cut what's left of our share of central funding from around £3 million in 21-22 to almost nothing by 25-26. All that said, We've still been able to balance next year's budget, as I said, with no cuts to our services or to the funding we provide to local community organisations that do such a fantastic job of helping our most vulnerable residents and who've massively stepped up over the course of the pandemic. Thanks to the great work of all of our officers, our cost efficiency and revenue generating measures are delivering, and we continue to look for more ways to achieve even more. But in the long term, such heavy cuts that we're experiencing to our central government funding simply aren't sustainable. The government's unpredictable and fragmented approach to financing local councils is broken, and it needs to be fixed so that the vital services we provide to our communities can be protected for the future. So the cross-party overview and scrutiny committee will consider the budget proposals and pass on comments to the council's executive, which is due to meet on the 8th of February before the final budget is put to the full council on the 22nd of February. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. Councillor Townsend.
Thank you. I've already obviously passed on my thanks to Anne-Marie, but I would like to take this opportunity when Mark was speaking there about Anne-Marie to thank all of the executive, to be honest, because the amount of time that all of them give up and all of them, you know, the energy, the enthusiasm, you know, the literally sitting on Zoom from 9 till 9 sometimes all day long. I think often residents don't see that and they don't appreciate that. And you know, it is sometimes a thankless task. It is rewarding, but equally, you know, everybody on this executive puts in a huge amount of time. I have really enjoyed having the portfolio for leisure and green spaces, and I do give it up slightly reluctantly, but equally, I know that Kika will do an amazing job, and hopefully, you know, I will be there if she's got any issues or that or wants to run anything by me. It has really been an honour to be on the executive, and I hope completed some significant projects so far. At the moment, I have mentioned previously when I was talking about the tree and woodland management policy that we're just completing the biodiversity strategy, and the final comments on that are due at the end of this month. This is another bit of really pioneering work by this council, showing yet again our commitment to tackle the impact of a recorded 56% decline in UK wildlife species, and clearly defining our role as custodian of several key habitat areas across the borough. We're also on track to present the final report and all the supporting documents of the Dunsfold Park Garden Village SPD. And I would like to take this opportunity once again to thank officers. Again, people don't see what they do, they're in the background, but their hard work and commitment to this project is admirable. And it's been a pleasure to work with Allies and Morrison, who have been the consultants who've been helping us. And they've made a huge push to ensure that we get this over the finish line. And finally, I'd also like to thank our the Dunsfold Advisory Group, who I work with, which includes representatives from the parish as well. And their comments and their local knowledge is invaluable to moving the SPD forward. And finally, Design Southeast. It's the first time that I've worked with them, and their professional input and also their encouragement to deliver the SPD has been really, really uplifting. The standard of work that we have achieved and the adherence to an extremely tight timetable indicates just how agile this council has become. And you know, that may surprise some people. But we, you know, we will be presenting this to the executive on the 27th of January, and then it will go before full council in February. So that's my updates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Townsend. Councillor Marriott.
Thank you, Leader. I think we all can recognise discrimination wherever it it appears, but it's the EDI portfolio holder which is me. EDI is supposedly supposed to alleviate the effects of discrimination, and there is very difficult one to prove that you have been successful or not. But one of the ways that we have been tackling this so far is to study our own workforce. This is an area where the impact can be measured more easily, and you can assess the progress made. The work is carried out in the main by the Corporate Equality Group, which meets regularly to monitor the well-being of the staff. And a part of its monitoring recently sent out a voluntary staff survey, which was actually well, the answer was well, we had a lot of answers, right? The EDI feedback coming back from the staff survey was more positive than the last time the survey was carried out, with 95% of the respondents agreeing that Waverley was an equal opportunities employer, 93% feeling they were treated fairly at work, and 94% agreed that they were free from bullying and harassment, when they felt free from bullying and harassment at work. The comments in the survey also suggested that the work of the Corporate Equality Group had been noticed by the staff. That is quite an important thing. Notwithstanding this, the survey also showed that further work may be and will be necessary. And as always, there's never a point at which you can say the answer has been found and no further work is needed. It always has to be active and dynamic. So the work is also continuing in the Equalities Action Plan, which will be presented to the council as soon as the management group have finished considering it. I don't have much to report on the newest part of my portfolio, which is one which I inherited from Anne-Marie. And can I just say that I haven't worked with Anne-Marie at all until I was on the portfolio, and as soon as I on the executive, and as soon as I was on the executive, she left, unfortunately. But during the time she was here, I just will say I will really miss her quiet and smiling competence. She was always there. She was always doing the job, and in a fantastic way. So I will miss her too, even though I was only with her for a very short time. As part of the community safety portfolio, I haven't done a great deal, as you might expect, but I have attended a virtual meeting on youth services by Surrey, which actually both highlighted the EDI issues relating to the Gypsy Romany traveller community, but also to community safety issues regarding to the youth work. It was good to see and hear people from other boroughs working on the same problems and how they approach them. So it's a good time to see how it all fitted together. I'd like to thank all the officers who have helped during the survey and the feedback from the survey, but especially Sally Kipping, who allowed me to sit in on one of the feedback sessions, not the one on councillors, but the one on the EDI issues. And also Louise Norrie, who is a great help to me and keeps me on the straight and narrow, well, mostly anyway. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Merritt. I think we all wanted to sit in on the councillor one, but nobody would let us. Councillor Williams, and apologies, your microphone, Councillor Merritt.
Thank you, Leader. I make no apologies for adding my thanks to Anne-Marie and admiration of Anne-Marie for her amazing work and dedication in her role as a portfolio holder for housing. It was an absolute delight to work with her on the sustainability issues around housing, and we're beginning to see the sort of legacy of the tremendous work that she was doing. And you know, we will very much miss her on the executive. I personally will miss her a great deal, but very pleased that she'll be continuing in her role as a councillor. I also want to kind of, in terms of the comments on the sort of changes in the portfolios on the executive. I would also like to absolutely take my hat off to Andy MacLeod for his patient dedication in the enormously demanding role of planning portfolio holder. I was going to say unenviable role of planning portfolio holder, and I would add good luck. Good luck, Liz. Lots of challenges. I think I did not put in my 2 pence, otherwise we'd have held up the proceedings even longer when we were talking about planning. But as I say, lots of challenges, and I'm sure Liz is up to it. But many thanks to Andy. I'd also like to say how much I look forward to working with Paul Rivers joining the executive, and I'd like to wish well, in fact, all the portfolio holders who are taking on new roles. Unlike some of us who are sort of just continuing with the work that we have been doing, and I'm delighted to be able to do that. And in terms of my own portfolio, work, we did hold what I think was the 3rd meeting of the Climate Emergency Board today. And what clearly emerged from that was that, you know, addressing the climate emergency is not just the domain of the sustainability team. It's very clear, for example, that what is required if we are to have the kind of impact that we need is a change in the culture of the council. And I think we have begun to see that change in the culture of the council, where climate emergency in response to what is a crisis for our planet actually infuses decision-making at all levels and in all areas in this council, and that's something which I feel really positive about at the moment. But there's an awful lot of work to do. It was very clear, for example, in today's discussion that you know, the plans for Passive House standard at minimum leisure centre in Cranley are key to a significant, i.e. about 12% reduction in Waverley Borough Council's direct carbon emissions. And we did focus today, and it's fitting in terms of, you know, the point at which we're changing housing portfolio holder. It's fitting, I think, that because social housing is so significant, we did hear a presentation today by Peter Davis on housing maintenance and the climate emergency. And in terms of the discussion that we had, I think we're beginning to understand the complexity and the challenge of mapping out a trajectory to net zero carbon housing stock in operation by 2030. It means the complexities of that mean that there is significant work to be done by our consultants, FFT, in mapping out and costing this trajectory. Early indications are that the trajectory to the desirable, to our target net zero carbon, our EPC A standard homes by 2030, will be something in the region of 120 million, as opposed to the much lesser cost, unfunded cost of the government's own much less ambitious target of EPC C. And, you know, as I say, I would raise the question as to where the funding for that is to come from. We have time and again supported cross-party calls for the government to fund appropriately detailed and appropriately costed plans to move to net zero carbon, and we will continue to do so. And one of the tasks of our asset management strategy is now that's now actively being developed is to ensure that we have that necessary depth of detail. And as part of this, housing officers are now proposing a deep refit of a small sample of our housing stock as a pilot, an important learning exercise going forward, so that we can be secure in our plans that I look forward to working with the new housing portfolio holders on in terms of our net zero ambitions for council homes. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. And last but certainly not least, Councillor Mirali.
Hard act to follow, hey? Right, mine's fairly straightforward, you'll be glad to hear. The Thriving Communities Commission, the fund is now closed, and there were 33 applications, with the majority being of a really high quality, with requests far exceeding the funding available. However, the successful organisations have been advised of their indicative level funding, with the caveat these are subject to full council in February. I think actually we're really happy with what we got, so it's very pleased about that. And regarding Farnham Museum, Bowles Green, who are doing the options analysis, have had to go back to the drawing board just because there's a couple of fundamental areas that needed to be addressed. So we're waiting for that to be done, and hopefully that will be this week. I look forward to taking on Parks and Countryside. I'm sorry about that, Liz. Don't envy you. And I will take up your offer, of course, for advice and assistance, which I'm sure I will need. And just to say, Anne-Marie, if you're watching this, and I hope you are, you must be feeling very, very loved and cared and respected. And thank you. We hardly had any time at all, but I do remember you offering your help very kindly, very generously when I was first started this. So thanks, and I wish you well and see you on the back benches.
Right, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for your wonderful comments and updates. I can now close this meeting of the executive at 16 minutes past 7.